When people think of the NES, they think Mario, Zelda, and Mega Man. But tucked away in that library was something darker, something gothic. In 1987, Konami released Castlevania on the NES, and it forever changed how horror and action could live on an 8-bit console. This wasn't just another game. It was the start of a legendary franchise. And for me personally, Castlevania was one of the first games I owned as a kid, along with Zelda and of course Mario and Duck Hunt. As much as I loved this game, one of the things I remember most was just how hard it was, at least for me at the time. But even with that, I still played it, and I played it a lot. That challenge is one of the things that made this game so unforgettable, and it's part of why I still come back to it even today. Today, we're diving into the full history of Castlevania on the NES, where it came from, how it was developed, and the design choices behind it, and why it still stands tall nearly 4 decades later. So get your whips and holy water ready, and let's step inside of Dracula's castle. The mid-1980s were a turning point. In Japan, Nintendo's Famicom had become a cultural phenomenon. In North America, the NES was resurrecting the console industry after the crash of '83. Players were falling in love with platformers like Super Mario Bros. And action titles like Ghosts and Goblins. But Konami, already a respected arcade powerhouse, wanted to do something different, something darker. Horror wasn't new to gaming, but it had never been fully realized. Arcades had monsters and skeletons, but they lacked the atmosphere of a true gothic horror story. Konami's designers drew inspiration from Universal monster movies of the 1930s and 40s, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and the Hammer horror films of the 1960s. These influences gave the game its cinematic flair. Look at the enemies, the architecture, even the lighting and stages, and you see the tribute to horror cinema. At the same time, Konami was pushing into many genres. In 1985 and 1986, they released arcade hits like Gradius and Twinbee, showing technical skill and creativity. But the Famicom Disk System, the Japanese add-on that allowed bigger games with save data, offered a chance to do something ambitious. A horror action game that felt like you were walking into a movie. This stood out in the NES landscape. Nintendo's games were lighthearted, Capcom's Mega Man was colorful, and most third-party titles leaned towards simple fun. Castlevania was different. It leaned into gothic architecture, horror tropes, and monsters pulled straight from films. Players weren't just running and jumping. They were storming a castle, facing nightmares, and feeling the weight of a horror setting brought to life on their console. Even the timing mattered. Horror was back in fashion in the 1980s. From slashers like Friday the 13th, to vampire hits like The Lost Boys. Konami tapped into the wave, creating a video game equivalent of a horror blockbuster. The first version of what we know as Castlevania appeared in Japan in September 1986. Its title? Akumajō Dracula. Demon Castle Dracula. Directed by Hitoshi Akamatsu, the project was a bold experiment. Akamatsu wanted a cinematic experience, and that vision shaped everything from the opening cutscenes to the bosses. Akamatsu was a mysterious figure. Little is known about him today, but interviews and research suggest he worked with a small, tight-knit team at Konami that was passionate about film and music. He envisioned Castlevania as a horror movie and video game form, and many of his design choices, the deliberate whip, the staged boss battles, the music cues, all came from that cinematic mindset. Akamatsu wanted players to feel like they were stepping into a horror film. The disk system allowed more storage and let players save progress. Japanese players could tackle the 6 blocks of the game, each split into 3 stages, with save support. Konami could add more music and animation. Even so, some ideas had to be cut. Garlic, stakes, and even directional whip attacks appear in early concept notes but never made it in. Still, these show how ambitious the developers were at the time. The team also had to deal with NES hardware limitations. The whip was slow not just by design, but because of the animation constraints. Enemy movement patterns were carefully crafted within memory limits. Backgrounds had to balance atmosphere with technical feasibility. These restrictions forced creative problem solving that gave Castlevania its unique rhythm and feel. Meanwhile, Konami also developed Vampire Killer for the MSX2 home computer. It shared the same theme but played differently. Slower, more exploration focus, fans often see it as a cousin to the NES version. Two different takes on gothic action. When Konami brought the game to North America in 1987, they faced a challenge. The title, Akumajō Dracula, carried religious overtones that Konami of America worried might cause backlash. Vice President Emil Heidkamp suggested a new name that kept the gothic feel but dropped controversy. The result was Castlevania. The NES cartridge meant changes. Without save memory or passwords, players had to beat the game in one sitting. That instantly made it feel tougher, a reputation the series still carries. Many remember the tension of losing late in the game and having to start over. That sense of high stakes became part of the Castlevania identity. Sound also shifted. The disc system's extra audio channel was gone. Composer Kinuyo Yamashita and Satoe Terashima reworked the soundtrack to fit NES limits, and the result was sharper and more aggressive. Tracks like Vampire Killer and Wicked Child lost depth but gained energy. The fact that they remain iconic today speaks to the quality of the compositions. Other changes came with localization. Nintendo of America had stricter content rules, so some graphics were tweaked to avoid religious or violent imagery. Sprites, palettes, and even enemy placements were adjusted. Localization wasn't just translation. It reshaped the game for a new market. By the time the cartridge launched in 1987, Konami had positioned Castlevania alongside Contra and Life Force as a flagship title. Marketing leaned into gothic horror, appealing to kids fascinated by monsters and haunted houses. What began as a very Japanese title became an international brand. At its core, Castlevania is a side-scrolling action platformer, but its details set it apart. Simon Belmont's whip, the Vampire Killer, was slow but powerful, creating a deliberate rhythm. Unlike Mario's jumps, Castlevania demanded patience. Every swing had weight and timing. Sub-weapons added strategy. Daggers gave precision, axes arced overhead, holy water froze enemies, the cross swept across the screen, and the stopwatch froze time. Now, unfortunately, these weren't free. They consumed hearts, collected from candles and enemies, making resource management part of the challenge. Do you spend hearts to survive now, or save them for the boss? Stages were designed as gauntlets, 6 blocks, each with a theme. Courtyards, dungeons, clock towers, and Dracula's throne room. Enemies weren't random. They were designed to push the player. Medusa heads flew in patterns meant to knock you into pits. Flea men bounced unpredictably, forcing careful timing. Even simple bats could ruin a jump. Then came the bosses. Giant Bat, Medusa, the Mummies, Frankenstein, and Igor, Death, and finally Dracula. Each fight felt cinematic, staged like a horror set piece, and they were tough. Death's spinning scythes remained infamous among players who lived through the NES era. What cemented Castlevania's place in history was its atmosphere. Konami's artists packed gothic horror into an 8-bit palette. Arched stone windows, candlelit halls, and stained glass. All details that pulled players into Dracula's world. Simon Belmont was drawn as a muscular barbarian hero, part Conan, part Van Helsing. His design contrasted with Mario's cartoon look, giving players a serious monster hunter to embody. The music elevated everything. Kinuyo Yamashita and Satoe Terashima didn't just write catchy tunes. They created horror themes within the NES's 5-channel sound chip. The songs Vampire Killer, Stalker, and Wicked Child built tension and urgency, and even in later Castlevania games have borrowed or remixed the songs. Even touches like the opening film sprocket effect or dramatic sounds cued reinforced the sense that Castlevania was cinematic in a way very few NES games had managed. When Castlevania launched in 1987, it wasn't the runaway hit Mario or Zelda were, but it stood out. Reviewers praised its gothic look, its haunting music, and unforgiving difficulty. For players wanting something darker and more mature, Castlevania delivered. In Japan, the disc system version already had fans. In the West, It gained traction in rental stores, where kids would swap stories about death scythes or Dracula's second form. Beating Castlevania became a rite of passage. It wasn't just about finishing a game, it was proving your skill. The challenge helped build its mystique. Players who conquered the game wore it like a badge of honor. The press also began to highlight how different it felt compared to other NES games at the time. Instead of cheerful mascots and bright fantasy worlds, here was a moody, gothic environment filled with dread. The contrast gave the game staying power. Even reviewers who criticized the stiff controls admitted that the atmosphere was unmatched at the time. By the early 90s, critics were calling it one of the NES's defining action platformers. Retrospectives have since praised its deliberate design and legendary soundtracks. Publications and fan polls often listed among the most influential titles of the 8-bit generation, right alongside Mario and Zelda. The reputation also carried into arcades. Konami developed Versus Castlevania for Nintendo's Versus System arcade cabinets. This version was even harder, with increased damage from enemies and stricter timers. It helped cement the game's image as punishing but rewarding. Today, Castlevania is remembered as more than just the start of a franchise. It showed that the NES could host moody, atmospheric adventures alongside its bright, family-friendly hits. That identity has lasted decades, cementing it as a cornerstone of gaming history. It remains a game that players discuss, speedrun, and revisit, not just for nostalgia, but because its core design still holds up. Castlevania's success sparked sequels. Castlevania II Simon's Quest in 1988 mixed in RPG-like exploration, day and night cycles, and hidden towns, experimenting with what the series could be. Castlevania III Dracula's Curse in 1989 returned to a more linear structure, but added multiple playable characters and branching paths, showing how flexible the formula could be. By 1997, Symphony of the Night redefined the series. Beyond sequels, Konami kept the brand alive across platforms. Spin-offs appeared on handhelds, arcades, and later on 16-bit consoles like the SNES and Genesis. The original NES game itself has been reissued repeatedly on the NES Classic, Virtual Console, and Konami's Castlevania Anniversary Collection. Each re-release brought new players into Dracula's castle and ensured the game's place in retro libraries. Castlevania also became a favorite in the competitive and speedrunning communities. Players have spent decades mastering whip timing, sub-weapon choices, and exploiting precise enemy patterns. Tournaments and charity speedrun events often feature it as a showcase of old-school difficulty and precision. Its design philosophy, slow, deliberate combat, tense atmosphere, and punishing but fair difficulty has influenced countless games. From indie hits like Shovel Knight to the entire gothic action genre, its legacy is everywhere. Even modern games outside the horror theme borrow its sense of weight and deliberate pacing. Part of what makes Castlevania timeless isn't just nostalgia, it's how intentional every detail was. The pacing, the enemy designs, the music, the atmosphere, all built to feel like storming a haunted castle. Yes, the stiff jumps and knockbacks still frustrate players, but those flaws added to the tension. Triumph felt sweeter because the game makes you earn it. Nearly 40 years later, Simon Belmont's first adventure is still celebrated. It wasn't just the birth of a franchise, it was proof that an 8-bit cartridge could capture the feel of gothic horror cinema. Its influence extends beyond gaming. The series inspired comics, novels, and in recent years, a popular animated series on Netflix. That show reintroduced the Belmont clan and Dracula to a whole new audience, proving the enduring power of the world first imagined on the NES. Ultimately, Castlevania endures because it strikes a balance. Part brutal difficulty, part cinematic yet simple, and all steeped in horror, but endlessly fun to play. Every new generation that picks it up discovers the same thrills players felt in 1987. Stepping into Dracula's castle, whip in hand, ready to fight through the night. So that's the story of Castlevania on the NES. From its roots on the Famicom disk system, to its legacy as one of the greatest action platformers ever made. It gave us Simon Belmont, unforgettable music, and a castle full of nightmares we still revisit today. What's your favorite memory of Castlevania? Was it surviving Medusa heads, finally beating Dracula, or just soaking in that legendary soundtrack? Share your stories with me down in the comments. I'd love to hear. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, subscribe, and check out my other videos on more retro classics. And as always, keep on gaming.